Hello and welcome to Topic 9, Lecture 1, where we're going to be talking about the right to bear arms. Okay, so I always start every lecture about the Second Amendment to remind students about how to spell the right to bear arms. And so it is the right to keep and bear arms, B-E-A-R. It's not the right to bear arms, wear a tank top. See, that dude's exercising their rights to bear their arms. Keep in mind, though, that it's not the right to arm bears. What? Oh, Paddington. Paddington needs a gun. Actually, in those recent Paddington movies, he might need a gun. So, anyways, just a fun way, hopefully, to remember that it's B-E-A-R, not B-A-R-E. Okay, so there's the language of the Second Amendment. A well-regulated militia, comma, being necessary to the security of a free state, comma, the right of the people to keep and bear arms, comma, shall not be infringed. Well, as you'll learn about in your textbook, this is one odd amendment in terms of trying to figure out what it means. For one, there's a lot of weird use of commas, making it sort of difficult to figure out what the main intent of the Second Amendment is. It's also a weird amendment because, as your textbook points out, it's the only amendment that has a preamble, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. It's like introducing with a preamble sort of clause the Second Amendment. And so because of the preamble, it's difficult, or there's disagreements about how to interpret the Second Amendment. And the question is, as you'll see in your textbook and as we're going to talk about in this lecture, is which of the two clauses is most important? Which is the one that holds the essential meaning of the Second Amendment? Is it the prefatory clause, which is also known as the militia clause? And so is it a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of the free state shall not be infringed, right? So is the meaning of the Second Amendment derived from the prefatory clause, the militia clause, or is the meaning of the Second Amendment derived from the operative clause, the right to bear arms? And so is the Second Amendment really saying that the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed? That's the meaning of the Second Amendment. As we'll see historically, that the Supreme Court initially interpreted the Second Amendment through the prefatory clause, saying that that was the clause that defined the essential meaning of the Second Amendment. But where we are today after DC versus Heller, that it's the operative clause, the right to bear arms clause, that is seen as holding the essential meaning of the Second Amendment. But it's been a source of disagreement, conflict. Of course, DC versus Heller was a 5-4 decision. So even on the court today, there's disagreement about how the Second Amendment should be interpreted. So some people interpret the Second Amendment as a collective right. In other words, it's focused on the rights of states, not on the rights of individuals. And this is the way that people who want the government to be able to control guns, to institute gun control measures. Those who advocate for gun control measures want the Second Amendment to be defined as a collective right. In other words, they think that the militia clause is the clause that is the essential meaning of the Second Amendment. And so from this perspective, what these folks are saying is that the Second Amendment is really about the states' rights for militias. They say that at the time of the framing of the Constitution, and keep in mind the Constitution gives Congress the power to raise armies and navies. It gives the federal government the power to create these standing, or what's known as a permanent federal armies. And as we know from the ratification process with the Constitution, the states were really worried that the Constitution gives the federal government way too much power, and it doesn't protect the power of the states. And so people who define the Second Amendment according to a collective right basically say that the Second Amendment is about the right of states to arm their own civilians to serve in militias in order to protect against any power grab that might take place under the creation of these new standing permanent federal armies. They argue it's not an individual right, okay? They basically say that because this is an amendment that has to do with the states' rights to form militias, that they argue that the Second Amendment is sort of not very relevant in the 21st century, really not relevant in the 20th century. It's sort of more, its relevance is more like the Third Amendment because it had more power and meaning during this battle between the federal government and the states in terms of the power. They basically state that states don't depend on militias anymore for defense. I mean, states don't, they don't rely on citizens to arm themselves in order to defend themselves from intruders. Today's states depend on the National Guard, a standing army that's a part of the broader national, government of defense, to provide that defense for the states. Okay, so from this perspective, it's collective right. It's about states pushing back the power of the federal government, and the Second Amendment thus does not have much relevance in a 21st century context. Now, other people interpret the Second Amendment as an individual right. And this is the way that gun rights advocates want the Second Amendment to be defined. They want the right to bear arms to be regarded as a fundamental individual right that gets the same levels of protection as other fundamental individual rights, such as the right to speak and the right to practice your religion. From this perspective, it's the Bear Arms Clause that controls the meaning of the Second Amendment. And so for them, they say the preamble is really just a preface to the real meaning of the Second Amendment. The real meaning of the Second Amendment comes from that the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. They say that is the core meaning of the Second Amendment. Now, keep in mind that folks who interpret the Second Amendment from this perspective, they say that bearing arms is a military phrase, that the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So they do see it as a military phrase. But they say that the key word in that phrase is the people, and that people implies individuals have a right to bear arms, and that this isn't a collective right of states. And one of the arguments that they make is that when you look at, they say that the word people is used in other places in the Constitution. In particular, it's used in the 10th Amendment. And in the 10th Amendment, it says the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. And so in the 10th Amendment, they use the word people to refer to individuals, not states. And so they said that this is saying that the individuals have a right to bear arms. They see this as an inalienable individual right to self-defense, and therefore the Second Amendment is just as relevant today as it was in the 18th century. So where do you stand? Do you think that the Second Amendment should be interpreted as a collective right? Do you think it should be interpreted as an individual right? Even if you view the Second Amendment as an individual right to bear arms, to what degree can it be curtailed? As we've learned during the course of this semester, no rights are absolute. There's always a reason where the government has there's oftentimes a compelling reason for the government to curtail our individual liberties. And so also when it comes to curtailing the individual rights, do you think public opinion, support or not support for gun control measures, crime levels, the number of mass shootings? As I'm writing this, there's another mass shooting that's taking place in a school in Knoxville, Tennessee. the gun's capacity to kill, etc. Should those play a role in what the court considers legal restrictions, as it considers whether restrictions on guns are in fact constitutional, or should those factors not play a role in the court's decision making? You're going to have an opportunity to discuss this in our online discussion this week. So very few cases have come to the Supreme Court that revolve around the Second Amendment. You might have noticed that the chapter for the Second Amendment is very, very short. You're probably like, hallelujah, after that long speech chapter that you read a couple of weeks ago, you're like probably happy to get a chapter that's about 10 pages long. Why have so few cases come to the Supreme Court regarding the Second Amendment? Well, a lot of it has to do with the fact that gun control matters are really seen as the purview of the states, not the federal government. And that's because of the 10th Amendment. The police powers are reserved to the states, right? So the states have the power to regulate the behavior of the people that live in their states. And so that means when it comes to gun control measures, the federal government really didn't get very involved in gun restrictions or regulations, just because it was seen as something that states do, of that power reserved to the states, the police power. So it's not until there's not a lot of federal gun control laws that come into play until the early part of the 20th century. And as we know, the first case that the Supreme Court hears on the Second Amendment is in the late 1930s. So what happened in the 20th century that led to a rise of the federal government getting involved in gun control restrictions? Early in the 20th century, we see a rise of crime throughout the United States, a national rise in crime. And as you probably know, the reason for that had to do in part due to the outlawing of alcohol. And so the 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act banned the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol. And you can ban alcohol just like you can ban drugs, but that doesn't mean people are going to stop producing it, selling it, and use it. But what it does mean that when you have these prohibitions in place, that a black market arises. And that's exactly what happened, that you saw that there was an underground market that led to the rise of organized crime in the United States in order to produce and transport alcohol and sell it. And that leads to a rise in crime. So it's also coupled with the economic turmoil from the Great Depression, increased in organized crime as it relates to the Volstead Act. But we see, a rise in crime, and that rise in crime is coupled with the rise in the use of guns, and that leads to the national government stepping in and passing the first national gun control measure, and we'll talk about that next. So Congress responded to the rise of violence in the United States with passing the National Firearms Act of 1934. As your textbook points out, this was not a general regulation of firearms. There was a concern that that kind of general regulation would not be constitutional because it would violate the 10th Amendment. Instead, it's a targeted regulation of certain kinds of firearms. And it focuses on two powers that Congress has, the power to tax and the power to regulate commerce between the states. A lot of crime control measures that are at the federal level depend upon the Commerce Clause in order to find a reason for why Congress can get involved in crime control matters. And so in this law, that the federal government placed an excise tax on certain and gun registration requirements on certain lethal weapons, machine guns, short barrel firearms, sawed-off shotguns. These were all viewed as extremely dangerous, sort of like military grade, and therefore the Congress had an ability to, protect people from these kinds of weapons, or at least to be able to sort of keep track of these weapons through an excise tax and a gun registration. It also banned the postal and interstate transport of the weapons that were covered by the National Firearms Act. So a relatively modest law, but still allowed the federal government to have some restraints. If you're not able to register it, if you don't pay the excise tax, if you are transporting it from one state to another, it allows the federal government to get involved and hold people who do that accountable, hopefully kind of having impact uh, on trying to decrease crime in the United States. So the National Firearms Act is the backstory for the first case that the Supreme Court hears on the Second Amendment. And this case is United States versus Miller. It's a case from 1938, or I'm sorry, 1939. And in that picture, there is the person who is named in this Supreme Court case, Jack Miller. Jack Miller was from the O'Malley gang, which they were bank robbers in Oklahoma. And I guess him and the O'Malley bank robbers, I didn't really know that Oklahoma like had this long storied history of like gangs, like sort of like spectacular celebrated gangs and bank robbers, but it seems to be the case. And Jack Miller was a part of that storied history. And so Jack Miller joins the O'Malley gang and they rob banks. And he loved to carry around his sawed-off shotgun. He would sit in the car as the getaway person, the lookout person, and the getaway person. He'd be driving the getaway car while the other folks were in there robbing the banks. And so he was a flamboyant character. He drank too much, involved in bootlegging. Big talker, the historians say, really big personality. But it's not those things that got him in trouble. What got him in trouble was his sawed-off shotgun. And so Jack Miller was transported his sawed-off shotgun from Oklahoma to Arkansas, and he was driving a car with his buddy. And so he got pulled over and found the sawed-off shotgun, and that he was then charged with violating the National Firearms Act because that his sawed-off shotgun, he had not gotten the excise, he hasn't paid the excise tax, he hadn't gotten it registered, not a big surprise there. And so that he was charged and found guilty of violating the National Firearms Act. And so in the case, the U.S. v. Miller, the question comes before the court as to whether or not the National Firearms Act is in fact constitutional, or does it violate the Second Amendment. So the question for the court in U.S. v. Miller was, does the National Firearms Act violate the Second Amendment of the Constitution? And in a unanimous decision, it says that it does not violate the Second Amendment. We'll probably never see a unanimous decision regarding the Second Amendment, at least not in my lifetime, probably not in yours either. What was the argument that the court made in this decision? They interpreted the Second Amendment according to the militia clause, okay? They basically said owning or using a sawed-off shotgun is not related to the preservation of a well-regulated militia. This sort of weapon is not an ordinary military weapon. As such, we cannot say that the Second Amendment allows for the ownership of this kind of gun, because the only time you could own a gun was in order to have a state militia. And you don't need a sawed-off shotgun to have a state militia. And so they basically interpreted the Second Amendment as a collective right, not an individual right. Now, some argue that this decision supports the collective interpretation of the Second Amendment, but others say that not so quick. They say that it actually reinforces the individual right. They basically said that you do, that they're not saying you don't have an individual right to bear arms. They're just saying that an individual doesn't have a right to bear an arm that's a sawed-off shotgun, because you don't need a sawed-off shotgun in a militia. And so they say it doesn't completely close the door on an individual right interpretation of the Second Amendment. But from a jurisprudence perspective, Miller decision is seen as reinforcing the collective rights interpretation of the Second Amendment. So the collective right interpretation of the Second Amendment was a precedent of the court for 70 years. As we know, this comes to an end in the District of Columbia v. Heller case, DC versus Heller, the 2008 case. We're not going to go over the facts of the case, in lecture. It's a landmark case. It's very easy to read the opinion and the dissents as well. So I am expecting you to do that. Particularly because we're going to be having our online discussion this week, which will pull upon what the court decides in Heller. Spoiler alert, the court rules that the Second Amendment is an individual right to bear arms. But keep in mind that Scalia, who writes the majority opinion in Heller, says all rights, that it's not without limits. I'll leave it to you to read the case. And reading the case, it'll provide some needed background information for the online discussion this week. All right. Thanks a lot. And I will talk to you again soon.